Welcome to the show, everybody. Today I'm talking about one of the greatest albums ever made, Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys from 1966 on Capitol Records. I am so excited to dig into this album because I am a huge Beach Boys fan. I got really into them in high school and I drove around in my 57 Chevy all around Santa Cruz blasting that music. I loved surfing USA when they would say Santa Cruz. I felt so proud to grow up in a town where surfing was cool and the Beach Boys knew it and they put it in a song. But you know what? That is a completely different side of the Beach Boys. This album is something very different, very special. Let's get started. While this is technically a Beach Boys record, it's pretty much all Brian Wilson. He more or less made this album himself with the help of session musicians, some of whom include members of the Wrecking Crew. I should note, however, that this was not the first time session players were used on a Beach Boys record. It's just that their use on this album was so extensive. In fact, the rest of the band was away touring during most of the recording, a choice Brian made so he could devote all of his attention on the album. Recording began in the fall of 1965, but it wasn't until Wilson heard Rubber Soul for the first time that the concept for Pet Sounds really takes shape. The Beatles unknowingly helped him realize that an album could be a cohesive whole, not just singles with filler songs, a practice that was common in his own work with the Beach Boys' previous albums. Newly inspired, he was hell-bent on creating, in his own words, the greatest rock album ever made. By spring of '66, the album was nearly complete. All that was needed was for the other Beach Boys to record their vocal parts. Upon hearing the new tracks, some of the members didn't know what to make of them. The songs were very different from their earlier work, and there were legitimate concerns of how they were going to perform them live. However, Wilson's passion for the project quelled their fears, and the rest is history. In the end, the album cost around $70,000 to produce, which would be around $500,000 in 2015 dollars. It was released on May 16, 1966, and while it hit the number 10 spot, that's about as high as it got. It was blamed that Capitol didn't push it as hard as they did with their other albums, but it also didn't help that critic reviews were lukewarm at best. While it did do better overseas, hitting number 2 in the UK charts, the damage was done. Wilson was hurt by the overall response in the States. He had put so much of himself into this album. To have it go unrecognized, he took it personally. Over the years, Pet Sounds has gained critical acclaim as evidenced by its number 2 position on Rolling Stone's 500 Greatest Albums of All Time, right below Sgt. Pepper's, which is fitting since Sgt. Pepper's was heavily influenced by Pet Sounds. There was this sort of unspoken friendly competition between the two bands during the mid to late 60s, as they were among some of the biggest acts in the US, and because they were both on Capitol Records, it's only natural that they'd be kind of curious as to what the other was doing. So there was this sort of like, okay, Rubber Soul comes out, then Pet Sounds, then Sgt. Pepper's, of course Revolver's in there, and then everyone was expecting Smiley Smiley to be this fantastic album, and then it didn't happen. And people kind of scratch their heads like, wait, what happened? And my hunch is that because of the critical response of Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson dramatically scaled back his ambitions for Smiley Smile, or at that time it was called Smile. And I think had Pet Sounds been more well received at that time, Smile could have been this amazing album, could have even topped this, but unfortunately, we'll never know. And I know the Smile sessions came out, but to me, it's not quite the same thing as if he had been able to finish it back then, because who knows what they would have sounded like. On the cover, you got the Beach Boys, and while I like it, I do find it kind of odd because they're feeding goats at the San Diego Zoo. But at the same time, it's pretty typical because all of Beach Boys albums, I find, are very literal of whatever the title is. What's even more odd is Pet Sounds itself, which is kind of a funny title, and what's even funnier is that there's no one conclusive story as to how this came to be. Each member has their own version of it. My favorite has got to be that Pet Sounds are your favorite sounds, or in this case, songs, music in that sense. It's similar to teacher's pet, if you've ever heard that term. On the back side here, we have a photo collage of the Beach Boys, which is very typical of this sort of release. But what's not typical is some of these photos, they're dressed up in traditional Japanese clothes, and I have no idea why. I don't know if they're being weird, or if they were on tour in Japan, or if this was some sort of promotional film. I don't know. If you guys have the backstory, let me know. The other thing I wanted to show you is the advert sleeve that the record originally came in. in. What cracks me up is that the Beach Boys to me are a young person's band, and here you have an advertisement showing off all these adult contemporary music, most of which you can find today rotting away in the bins of thrift stores. But that's not to say I wouldn't buy some of these albums. In fact, I think I even own some of these. On the flip side here, it's a little more hip with the Beatles and other Beach Boys albums being advertised here. You also got Buck Owens and Wanda Jackson, so that's cool, but the rest are just more of the same. What cracks me up is that Liza Minnelli is right below Judy Garland. I mean, if that's not a metaphor for her life, I don't know what is. She just can't get out from under her mom's shadow. Alright, big confession time. I have never listened to this album before this review, and I think that's because I didn't own it before. The only songs I did know were the singles, which are Wouldn't It Be Nice, God Only Knows, and Sloop John B., which are coincidentally some of my favorite Beach Boys songs. So really, it's a wonder why I never owned it before, and I guess that's just because I would always listen to them on the radio, or I'd get their best of albums. Now that I've heard it, oh man, I have been missing out. I love this record. It could very well be my favorite Beach Boys album. It has so much to offer, from up-tempo tunes to somber songs and even some instrumental tracks. What I really enjoy about this record is that you can tell Brian Wilson took a lot of influence, not just from rock, but elements from Exotica, harmonica bands, and even Nelson Riddle-style Sinatra. And yet, it's still the Beach Boys. I think that's so amazing. He can take something so different, so new and fresh, and yet it retains that quality, that almost intangible quality of a Beach Boys record. I mean, you can play this for someone who's never heard it, and they'll know instantly that it's the Beach Boys. I really like how the album ends with the sound of a train passing by and dogs barking. I don't know what Wilson meant by this, but it did strike a chord for me. As many of you know, I grew up in a beach town, and we had this train that ran right along the coast, so I associate those sounds with being at the beach, which makes this album incredibly nostalgic. When I listen to it, it reminds me of the times I would spend all day at the beach, and there's this electric feeling you have on your skin when the sun goes down and you're in warmer, comfy clothes, maybe gather around a bonfire and the ocean's right next to you and the sand is still warm. To me, this album is the embodiment of all of that. For me, this album is all about growing up. That time when you feel you're an adult, but you don't yet have all the freedoms of an adult. It's about transitions, letting things go, your first love, your first loss. It's also about things that are new, as this was new territory for this band. It elevated the Beach Boys from surf rock teen pop to a higher level. Some even consider it art rock or progressive rock. From a production standpoint, the album works flawlessly. I love it. It's a great listen all the way through. It really works as a whole unified work. Brian Wilson did an amazing job, and it's especially impressive when you consider he was only 23 when he made it. If you haven't heard it yet, I highly recommend that you do. It may very well change your opinion of the band. Now, if you're in the market for a copy, there are a lot of options. First and foremost, I recommend looking for a mono pressing, mostly because it's the version Brian intended. I know that sounds cliche, but hear me out. At this time, Brian felt he had more control over the final sound because of the way stereos could be placed or misplaced. Most cars had mono systems, and TV and radio broadcasted in mono. It just made more sense. Also, Brian was nearly deaf in his right ear, so stereo never did much for him. My second recommendation is to go for an original issue, like I Have Ear. Though some people claim it doesn't sound as good as the 1972 reissue, which was paired with the album Carl and the Passions, to my ears, this version sounds just fine. For those of you digging in Australia, please note that the album was released as the Fabulous Beach Boys, with a completely different photo on the cover. Now, if you have deep pockets, I mean really deep, the 1995 DDC version is highly praised by collectors and audiophiles alike. It was pressed in limited quantities, so good luck trying to find a copy. For the 40th anniversary in 2006, Capitol reissued the album as a double LP gatefold, with record 1 being the mono mix pressed on yellow vinyl and record 2 the stereo mix on green vinyl. The whole presentation is really cool, but only 10,000 copies were pressed, so it's also rather pricey. In 2008, Capitol put out another reissue, this time as a mono-only release on 180-gram black vinyl. It's been noted that it was mastered from a digital source, so I would avoid that issue unless you can score a great deal on it. What I do like about it is that they reprinted the original advert sleeve that I talked about earlier. With any release, expect to pay at least $25, but I'm sure you can score a great deal if you're patient and are okay with an album in less than near mint condition. I want to know what you guys think. How does this album rate? Should it be the #1 album of all time? Is it the best Beach Boys album ever made, or is there one better? Which one might that be? Well, that is the show for today. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. I honestly, seriously, really appreciate it. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side. Yes, pet sounds. Oh my goodness. They're feeding goats. Did I say sheep? They're feeding goats. They're not feeding sheep. These are goats.